Hi, it's Jerry Roberts, and we're back with our series of community conversations about the coronavirus and how people are coping in a new world. And we are delighted to welcome Santa Barbara's first economic development manager, Jason Harris. Jason, thanks so much for taking the time. I know you're up to your eyeballs and stuff. I appreciate it.
Certainly. Happy to be here.
So I got to ask you, you accepted the job in February, and then by the time you started work, the world had changed. We had the worst public health crisis since World War One, and the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And on the day you started, Newshawk runs a headline that says, "New Economic Development Manager walks into Santa Barbara chaos." So how are you enjoying the play, Mrs. Lincoln? I mean, your expectations were not what you have been greeted with.
That's true. For what the job description was, what I was recruited to be, things changed dramatically. I think a couple of things. First off, what the job position entitles is really establishing an economic development plan, working on revitalization of the downtown. That's the core function and focus of my work. Obviously, that's had to be postponed somewhat. It's really triaging and address the critical needs of supporting our businesses during this economic shutdown. And so I immediately triaged into the organization and started working with my colleagues throughout the organization to see what the city could do. Our hands were somewhat tied in the regards that we were living under a state stay-at-home order under the governor and the state's public health director. And so we've begun. From that point, it's now been almost 2 months now. It was really a matter of what can we do to assist the businesses fairly quickly. In working with the mayor, we identified, the city working in its singular capacity was going to be limited in understanding. So we convened a group of 20 businesses and business representatives.
The task force.
The task force, exactly. We've been meeting. We actually have a meeting tomorrow. This will be our, fourth or fifth meeting. We meet weekly with them. They immediately identified a number of recommendations, ideas. We broke out into committees to refine those concepts. And the first of those recommendations went to council this past week, which was the idea to support our food service operations in the city. We have over 400 restaurants, cafes, and eateries throughout the city. What could the city do? They can operate up until today, and there will be news, I'll reference that. Up until today, they're essential businesses, but can only operate in a takeout delivery methodology, not substantive and sufficient to support many of those operations. And so the task force identified the concept of allowing outdoor dining in any and all capacities. That's what I presented to council. Council unanimously agreed and supported the concept. Actually went as far to also add city properties to the list to allow restaurants to expand on city properties, be it surface parking lots that would be adjacent to their operations. And so that's now going into effect. We're working furiously to develop the guidelines and information instructions to all those operators to how to go about to set up those operations.
So what's the news you referenced?
So the news I referenced was up until today, literally, we were operating under the state stay-at-home order.
Right.
The county supervisors approved on Tuesday. We're working in real time, literally hour by hour at this point. So on Tuesday, the county supervisors approved the county reopening plan. That immediately went to the state. The state approved, as I understand, last night, the county plan. So that is now in effect, and the county health order is, if it hasn't been released, will be released, which will allow greater business activity to now resume in Santa Barbara County. And obviously the city of Santa Barbara part of that. So that will now allow for some limited indoor dining in retail to operate beyond the curbside pickup. I actually just opened the documents to start reviewing what other business activity will now be allowed. So we're kind of in the later stage of stage 2. There's various stages of reopening the economy. We're still in stage 2, which means there's still substantive limitations, but there now are, we're under the county plan. And there's a lot of information online. The county's posted. So we're kind of digging through that and preparing to communicate that out to businesses and assist them.
So at the council meeting, of course, there was a lot of discussion about closing State Street, the decades-old debate that we've been having here forever. And as I understood your position, you were saying, it doesn't really make sense to close the street if we don't have pedestrian traffic. If we build it, they will come. In the end, I guess you sort of everybody decided to do both things. So what is the timetable that you're working with now? A, in terms of closing State Street, B, in terms of getting the restaurants on these parklets and sidewalks and so on and so forth. Is that going to be up and running for Memorial Day weekend?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I've been in meetings all morning, breaking that down and thinking through it. We have a variety of issues we're processing. One is just the physical operational aspects of putting up the barricades, closing the street, ensuring that traffic and public safety is being maintained. We've got the secondary issue, which is the council action on Tuesday was really multi-part. One, they gave authorization for the city administrator to use his emergency powers to allow for the closure and allow for this business activity to occur. Concurrently, the city attorney's office is working on an emergency ordinance that would go forward to council on June 2nd that would memorialize all of this and take us out of emergency powers into formal powers. The action is multi-part. So when we speak to outdoor dining, it's in a variety of places. It's allowed on sidewalks. It's allowed on street parking. It's allowed on closed streets. It will be allowed on private property. And the council also included city property. But each of those spaces have slightly different guidelines of operational considerations that we're working through in real time to provide that direction and assistance to businesses. Concurrent to that, we're also assisting the business community understand the other licenses they have. Allowing the business activity is really a zoning issue. We're suspending all of our zoning and regulatory powers under the city to allow that, but they also have a license with the county for food service. So I've got to digest, but my understanding is the county is going to suspend their county health obligations or effectively allow food service outside of the premises in an outdoor dining configuration. So I believe that box will be checked. And then the secondary aspect are for those food service operators that have alcoholic service ABC licenses, they will need to modify that. We've been in direct contact with ABC to facilitate. Their office is closed. The closest office is in Ventura. It's closed. So people have to mail in the licenses. It will take at least 5 days. We're conceptualizing and working in real time to pull this all together to have a workshop, walk businesses through. We would collect their applications, their $100 permit fee, and drive it down on behalf of the businesses and give it directly. We have a direct relationship, our police office, with ABC. So those can be processed in a very much quicker, shorter timeline. So we're trying to put that all together. We're trying to communicate that to businesses. To get back to your question, when are we closing State Street? We are contemplating the possibility of closing it as early as tomorrow, but we're thinking through all of these issues. We haven't established our guidelines and communicated those out, so businesses won't necessarily know how to set up and where to set up. For instance, they won't have the liquor license, so they can't serve alcohol directly, and the public can't consume. We're not creating an open container environment. Right. So we're trying to think through all of these issues in real time and be timely and support the businesses. And then we also try to balance and understand the needs of the consumer. The question mark, how many consumers, how much of our local residents are going to go out and start supporting the businesses? Now that we're in the stage two, the latter stage of stage two, businesses can reopen. They can have indoor dining, as I understand, on a limited social distancing capacity. So that may be sufficient for this coming weekend. So we're balancing that. We're thinking through it. I've been in multiple meetings this morning. We have some more meetings this afternoon to think through this. And we're obviously doing everything we can to get everything in place and support our businesses. We want them to succeed and reopen and recover.
All right, so let me just break it down a little bit. So who is on the city side, who is the decision maker about permit zoning kinds of issues that the restaurants and retail will be required to take, the actions that will be required? Who's going to say, yeah, that's okay, you can do that, you can put these tables in the parking lot?
Ultimately, it's a public works. They are the department that oversees right of way. So when it comes to the context of how business is set up on sidewalk, how they set up on street parking, how they set up in a closed roadway, they're the ones that need to define that from an operational public safety standpoint. But it's also a team collaboration. So we're obviously working with city attorney's office to establish the understanding of legal issues, ADA, First Amendment rights. All of that has to be taken into context, right? So when we're closing the right of way, we still have to be respectful and recognize the First Amendment rights of free speech and access. We have to maintain ADA accessibility, et cetera. So it's all these kind of intricate components that we're trying to overlay so that we maintain those conditions, but we also provide the opportunity for commerce. And so that's what we're working through here in real time to communicate and give direction on.
And is it not the case that restaurants also have to do a so-called attestation to the county or to the state that they are going to operate from a public health perspective in a safe way?
Correct. Fortunately, that's the good news there is that's online. It's I just went and just looked at it 30 minutes ago because it just got released this morning. So that's an online form effectively that's filled out, and there's a lot of signage requirements. So the businesses are required to post signage throughout their business areas, indicating that they're meeting these conditions and these guidelines. And they obviously have some operational conditions that they're attesting to, that they'll ensure that their employees are healthy, that they are having health checks of their employees, that they're sanitizing their spaces, et cetera. So public health is being maintained. It's the obligation of the businesses to meet those conditions, and that's where the self-assessment is occurring.
All right. So you were hired basically to, as you said, revitalization, an economic development plan, really big structural problems. Now you walk into this situation where, what's in front of me right now, this second. How do those two fit together? Are you like completely focused on the here and now, or are you thinking that as this unwinds, this is going to align somehow with the vision of the structural change vision?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Fortunately, I've got an extensive background in economic development. So I've managed projects, I've developed programs. So right now, this is really project development, right? We're implementing a program and triaging, as you would, a project of thinking through all the stages and putting into implementation. So I'm obviously utilizing those skill sets to work through and lead the city's efforts in this capacity. But that being said, is the longer term vision that we will transition out of this kind of acute triage business survival assistance approach to the longer term revitalization strategies. And those are more the macro issues as you're describing. But we're going to get opportunities right now in the real time to explore and test. There's obviously been the concept, as you've raised, of exploring the idea of closing State Street and creating a pedestrian mall, as it were. Well, we're going to do that right now, principally to support our food service businesses, to allow the expansion of outdoor dining. But by doing so, we're also creating the opportunity where the pedestrians are going to see a downtown environment that is free of vehicular car traffic and be able to have, in addition to really wide depth of State Street sidewalks, the ability to walk down the center lane, effectively center line of State Street, because we're going to maintain a fire lane down the middle of State Street. That's a public health requirement from a life safety standpoint, and that will be the public corridor through the middle of State Street, of which then you'll have the outdoor dining off to the sides of that.
All right, going back again to kind of why you're here, why you were hired, why the consultant hired by the city decided we needed an economic development manager. I mean, we've seen the collapse of retail most recently with Nordstrom announcing they're done. Tourism, obviously is extremely dicey at any time, but in a pandemic, it's kind of, and those have been the anchors of the economy in Santa Barbara. What do you see, 3, 5 years out as being the core economic functioning of the downtown and of Santa Barbara, the city of Santa Barbara?
Certainly, certainly. Well, in 3 to 5 years, we're not going to completely transform the industries that this community is built around. So tourism and hospitality and leisure industries are all interconnected here, and they are the lifeblood of this community. That being said, there's clearly a need to diversify our economy and revitalize our downtown to make it beyond a tourist destination. And in that regards, there's very clear and consistent action taken across the world that we're going to be implementing. So, I was optimistic to see the city already had effort underway. Council is extremely focused on pursuing housing in downtown. The community development department's working on modifying the AUD. It's a housing program to fill in the downtown district that was not initially a part of that program. So that's going to be critical for vitality and revitalization of having residents right in the core. And it's a hallmark. All the successful revitalizations of urban cores around the U.S. and the world are really predicated on having a strong residential base. Secondarily, diversity of our economy to be less reliant on kind of the tourism, on the retail, historical engines, really is looking to those industries that we have presence already. And that's our technology sector, our information sciences group. We've got a number of companies already located here in that regard. And so growing that, and that's a relatively challenging prospect of how do you attract, build, and grow a sector in that regard, kind of the entrepreneurial gardening, as they would like to refer to it in economic development industry. But we've got some really critical assets that make a huge difference. First off, we have an amazing quality of life in this community. The natural environment, the amenities that we have, food service, the cultural aspects, art and culture abounds to no limits here. So that right there already attracts the creative, knowledge-based workforce that wants to live in those places. And Santa Monica was in a very similar structure. So right there, you already have a competitive advantage against all the other communities who are trying to build the same kind of infrastructure of technology, creative capital economies. So then secondarily, you pair that with universities, which we have a number of, principally UCSB. And so there's a lot of startups coming out of those universities, young entrepreneurs, the professors that have side entrepreneurial jobs or interests that they're wanting to pursue. And then third is just having the infrastructure, be it the creative office space, the co-work space, the networking, the venture capital. Some of those are in place now. They can be expanded. And so those are some initiatives that I'll be working on and building those systems in place. So I think we'll see all of this come into alignment over the years. And housing is a part of it. The creative capital workforce, they want to live in urban cores. Most typically, they're young millennial types of entrepreneurs and thinkers. They're attracted to that environment and having those amenities close at hand. And so this all kind of works hand in glove in process. And then obviously we'll pursue other initiatives where we have, the light industrial, where we can expand and you find the linkages, right? You find those companies that are already here. You find the supply chains that are supporting those companies. You look to attract and grow that whole kind of industry sector. So there's a science and methodology, and I'll be working towards expanding and building upon it, because we do need to match jobs with our housing, and we do need to be job-based oriented.
So let me ask you specifically about Paseo Nuevo. Because obviously the anchor tenants are gone. The city's either has or is about to sign a 20 or an extension of the lease with the retail people there. But it sounds like you're saying you see that area primarily as housing with a little bit of mixed use. What Is that correct? Is that, am I characterizing that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's a good generalization. I mean, so we also have to take into factor what is the city's controls, right? Private property or property under some control, be it a contract of some nature, the city does not have unilateral ability to redirect that activity. So we really have to create influence and action. So in the case of Nordstrom's, it's closed, but they control the property. They have a 45-year lease remaining on that property. And so they have contractual rights of how they use it. And there's some ability of the city as the underlying ground owner that has that contract to work with them to influence change. And I've actually started reaching out to the executive team at Nordstrom's to begin that conversation. Part of this is how we work through these processes. When we're looking at housing development, that is going to be a construct of developers looking to acquire property or assemble property so that they can put it in place. And you have to recognize the underlying economics. What's the cost of land? We've obviously, the city has direct control of how we can facilitate the entitlements or permitting process and add improvements to that, which are in process. So there's just, it's a continuum of effort. And I think we need to establish the vision and pursue that diligently through what actions the city has direct control of, and then where we have areas to create influence. So as I discuss these concepts with, for instance, the Nordstrom's, it will be a context of, well, what are your plans? I don't expect that there's any other large general merchandise anchor tenants out there that might be looking for a new department store. That industry has shifted dramatically. And so it'll be interesting to hear what their thoughts and ideas are. But what I'm conceptualizing, it's predicated on economics and a number of other things, but could that site be converted into housing? Could that site be converted into an entertainment use? It's obviously built in place. The improvements aren't that old. So the idea that you would implode it and build from scratch, I think, is less likely. What's the adaptive reuse of that space, for instance? And, maybe you subdivide it and it becomes, a general public market that is kind of small local retailers with, independent operators of food mixed with entertainment. It could be a lot of things, but it's going to take, some creative thinking and some creative developers. I don't know if that is Nordstrom's, right? They may need to assign their interests to others.
Let me ask you this, because you're just kind of bursting with ideas and energy, and it's really great to hear someone that way. You had a pretty big staff in Santa Monica and a budget and these business districts. Here you're kind of the Lone Ranger. I mean, how is that? How are you adapting to that change in how you have to operate?
Yeah, there's a little difference for sure. But as I described, actually, this question came up on my interview panel. The skill set. I was a working manager, so I carried a workload. I wrote contracts, I reviewed contracts, I developed policies. So not having any substantive staff to support these efforts, we have a collaborative team of staff throughout the city. So I'm working with Nina Johnson in the city administrator's office closely. There's colleagues Rob Dayton and parking and transportation manager. So there's just some key colleagues that I'm working with to enable some of these initiatives, and I'm sure I'll grow my my colleague list of partners that I can work with. And as I've referenced, a lot of this is kind of building process, and I'm also working with this task force to develop recommendations of improving the community development permitting process, et cetera. So we're going to be incrementally working through these issues, making change, and pursuing vision. Ultimately, this will, when I get some breathing rooms and work through the triage of pandemic issues that we're working with right now, is ultimately pull this together in an economic development strategy and a plan, and take that out and get input from the stakeholders, and ultimately get approval and direction from council. And then we'll have a plan to work from, and then we can develop work goals and objectives and really pursue this in a strategic and thoughtful manner.
Let me back up to the community development department. And obviously that was a huge focus of the Cosmont report as well. This sort of bloated, interminable, Byzantine, what other adjectives, MC Escher-like bureaucracy that we have there about permits and trying to get anything done, build anything bigger than a doghouse. What is your brief there in terms of taking on that chronic problem?
So, I think just back to your description, the city collectively has done a lot of effort to evaluate, understand the various needs and issues. So, there's been the Cosmont study, there's been retail studies, there's a study underway right now that's going to council shortly, a NOVAC, an internal audit review. The task force is taking this up as well. There was a regulations and permitting committee, and they're actually reviewing a list of recommendations to forward to council for permitting process changes. So this is not an undefined or unknown issue, right? The problem's been identified. The suggestions and needs of what can be made improved are in process and in motion, and those are going forward. And now I think it's really a process of how do we assist that department to enact, right? And so these are a combination of enacting procedural process changes. Some of it will be, organizational cultural changes, and then some of it will be longer term efforts that, will involve the community or evaluating community processes. But I'd look to one example, for instance, Santa Monica, where I just left. They just reorganized pretty substantially their organization based upon their budget reductions and changes. And one of those substantive changes was they eliminated the architectural review board in that process, and they brought it in-house, and it's now in a staff administrative step. Now, that can't be done in Santa Barbara, because the architectural review board is written into the charter. So you have to go to the voters to seek that change. Now, no one's making that proposal, by the way, but I just use that as an example that some of these changes, as much as people may not like them or how can we streamline, et cetera, is like, well, they're built into the system. And by the way, they were built into the system, decades ago. Yeah. So, this is also kind of an incremental change, but I'm optimistic that once you identify a problem, then you can start identifying solutions, and then you can focus on the process to make the change and make improvement. And so I think we're well on our way to getting there. Obviously, it's going to take some time to work through, and I look to be an advocate to support those efforts.
Are you concerned that in that issue, specifically, you have responsibility without authority?
Well, obviously, I think this, this discussion I've had with a number of stakeholders as I've come into the community is, what is my ability to affect change? Well, obviously, the reality is I don't oversee the department, but I am a kind of an additional voice of perspective and an advocate, and I can look to assist and work with community groups, work with developers, work with community development staff to find process improvement, suggest change, advocate for projects. So I'll look to build upon all those skills and efforts to make a difference. How substantive and how effective to be identified and known, but I'm hopeful and optimistic I will make a difference.
All right, let me ask you real quick. How many kids you have?
I have 3.
How old are they?
My oldest is 22, and next 13, and then 10.
And they're in Thousand Oaks now, and your wife's working there?
Correct.
So what are you doing? It sounds like you're working 18 hours a day. Are you here? Are you there? Are you back and forth?
So I work about 12-hour days on average. I'm here during the week. I have a studio in town, and I'm here during the week, so I can really knock out a pretty hardcore schedule while I'm here, and then I go back to my home on the weekends.
All right. Well, Jason Harris, thank you so much for being with us. You sure have your work cut out for you, but it sounds to me like you got a lot of energy and ideas, and you're really attacking things. And I'm sorry this tidal wave of pandemic came up and hit you.
It's crazy times, but I actually feel very fortunate that I'm here to make a difference, and I'm really looking forward to supporting our businesses and creating new opportunities in the community.
All right, man. Thank you very much.